Hey, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I am going to share with you how to add sourdough discard to any recipe. It is a simple calculation that can transform any recipe you love into a sourdough creation. One of the things I want to share with you today is how to add sourdough discard to any recipe in grams and cups. I've seen a lot of calculations online that are all very helpful, but often they're in grams, which is actually the more precise way to do it. But I do know that many of you in the US, like me, have recipes that are in cups, and the calculation can get a little tricky. So today I'm going to show you both ways. So first we have to identify, what is sourdough discard? Sourdough discard is the portion of the starter that you remove during your regular feeding routine. So most of the time when we feed our sourdough starter, we take part of it and we feed it equal parts flour and water. And then there's this remaining portion, which we call discard. Now, I'm not a huge fan of calling it discard. I'm not sure if there's a better word for it, but what I don't like about the word discard is that it implies that it's trash or to be thrown away. When discard, it isn't trash at all. It's actually a really useful ingredient for lots of cooking and baking recipes. And really, that sourdough starter discard, it's made with flour and water. You wouldn't take flour from your pantry and just throw it away, so there's no sense in throwing away your starter. It can be put into lots of different recipes. So if the idea of sourdough discard is still a little bit fuzzy to you, I have a full YouTube tutorial that I will leave in the description box that talks about the difference between active starter, inactive, and discard, and that can help you figure out what the difference between all three is. So be sure to check that out. When we are adding sourdough discard to a recipe, it is important to understand the hydration of your starter. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is important later in this video, but first we need to know what that means with your starter itself. So when we are talking about a 100% hydration starter, that is just a really fancy and sort of concise way of saying your starter is fed equal parts flour and water. So let's say you're feeding your sourdough starter and you give it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. That is a 100% hydration starter. Sometimes I think people get a little bit tripped up with the language in sourdough, but there are really just two things you need to know when it comes to adding discard to any recipe. One, as I mentioned, discard is the portion of starter that you remove when you are feeding your starter, and that portion remains unfed. And then a 100% hydration starter is just one that is fed equal parts flour and water. So if you got that, you can do all of this. Okay, let's talk about how you actually add sourdough starter to a recipe. I'm going to first talk about this in grams because it makes more sense. So even if you are measuring your recipes in cups and you don't have a kitchen scale, I really recommend sticking through this part of the video because the next part when I talk about cups will make more sense. So when you are adding discard into a recipe, the first thing you need to do is decide how much starter are you going to use. And really, this is where things get a little murky because there isn't really a set amount. Now, I usually add between 50 and 100 grams because that's usually what I have, and that is pretty easy to add into a recipe. You could add up to 200 grams, but after that, I wouldn't really recommend adding more than 200 grams. So really anywhere between 50 and 200 grams is a good amount of discard to add into a recipe. For the sake of this video, let's just say that I am using 100 grams of sourdough starter discard. Step 2, divide the weight of the discard in half. We do this because a 100% hydration starter is made with equal parts flour and water. So we need to know how much that weighs. So half of 100 is of course 50. So that means your starter discard is made of 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. The reason we need to know how much flour and water is in the sourdough starter discard is because we're going to reduce that from the flour and liquid in the original recipe. Now, I will talk about the liquid and what constitutes liquid in a recipe later in this video, so just hang on to that. But let's just assume that in this pretend recipe that we're doing together, we are just using plain old water. So step 3 then is to look at the original recipe and see how many grams of flour and how many grams of water are in it. So then step 4, we simply reduce the flour and water in the recipe by half of the starter's weight. So if you recall, in step 2, we determined that it was 50 grams. So that means if our original recipe has 400 grams of flour, we are going to actually change the recipe so it has 350 grams of flour. And if the original recipe has, say, 150 grams of water, we are going to reduce that by 50 grams and add 100 grams of water. And after that, you just continue the recipe as usual, adding the sourdough starter discard with the liquid ingredients. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but let's just recap really quickly what this simple calculation is. So 1, weigh out your discard. 2, divide that in half. 3, subtract that number from the flour and the liquid in the original recipe. And 4, bake on. Okay, so that is how you add discard to a recipe if you are using grams, which I do recommend because it is a very easy calculation and is more precise and repeatable. But I also understand that if you are like me and you are in the US, a lot of our recipes are in cups. So this can be done in cups, but it is not quite as cut and dry. So if possible, I recommend converting your recipes to grams, but if not, I do have the solution for you. If you are adding discard using cups, the first thing you need to do is determine how much flour and water is in your starter. And this is where things get a little bit confusing because often when we are talking about sourdough starter discard and feeding and talking about that 1-to-1 ratio and 100% hydration, that is specifically referencing grams. So if you hear people talking about things like a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, fed equal parts flour and equal parts water, they're really talking about grams. When we are talking about volume measurements, it is no longer a 1-to-1 ratio because flour and water do not weigh the same. A cup of flour is a lot lighter than a cup of water, for example. So when we're talking about cups, it is no longer a 1-to-1 ratio. So we have to convert it a little bit differently. So if you are adding discard using cups, I recommend picking one measurement and really sticking with that through your recipes just to make it a little bit easier. Of course, you can always do what you want, and if you are a math whiz, maybe it doesn't even matter to you, but if this feels a little confusing, I recommend just sticking with about 100 grams of sourdough starter, which is equivalent to about 1/3 of a cup. It does not equal that precisely all of the time because gram to cup measurements are definitely not precise. It depends on how many bubbles are in your starter. It depends on what type of flour you fed it, if it's heavier or not. There are a lot of factors that go into that, but it is a safe bet to say that 100 grams of sourdough starter is around 1/3 of a cup. And here's where things get a little more confusing. So 1/3 of a cup of starter is made of approximately 1/3 of a cup of flour and somewhere around 2 tablespoons plus 2 teaspoons of water. It's not precise, but it is kind of close to that. So that means if you are adding 1/3 of a cup of sourdough starter discard to a recipe, you should reduce that recipe by 1/3 of a cup of flour or roughly that amount and 2 tablespoons plus 2 teaspoons of water, which is a little bit wacky if you ask me. So this is a little ambiguous and it's definitely not precise. So what I would recommend doing rather than like saying, oh, I need like 1/3 of a cup plus a fraction of a teaspoon, don't mess with that. Round the conversion to the nearest whole measurement. If you are adding about 1/3 of a cup of starter to your recipe, I would reduce the flour by 1/3 of a cup and then I would reduce the liquid by about 3 tablespoons. That's the closest even measurement and probably the easiest way to do it. Now, whether or not you're measuring in grams or cups, I would pay attention to the overall quality of your recipe, your batter or your dough, whatever it is that you're making. Because when you convert things, sometimes it just isn't quite the same. So be ready and willing to add a little bit of extra liquid, a little bit of extra flour. And the best way to know if you need to do that is through experience. Experience is the best teacher. So that means the more you do this, the easier it's gonna get because you're gonna know what you need to do. And along the way, you might make a few mistakes and you might have some dry cookies or something like that. But hey, all cookies are good dipped in milk. So just experiment and enjoy the process. If you need this information in a way that's a little more digestible and visual, I do have a full blog post that goes over this over at moonandmagnolia.com, and there's even a printable graphic there that breaks this down, so you can check that out if that is helpful for you. Okay, let's talk about what liquids your starter can replace. This gets a little bit tricky sometimes depending on the recipe, so we're going to talk about a couple of different options here. So generally, when we are talking about reducing the liquid, we're actually talking about true liquid: water, milk, juice, beer, tea, whatever is in your recipe. Recipes though sometimes call for other ingredients that contain liquid, like oil, vanilla, eggs. These sorts of ingredients do add to the overall hydration of your recipe, but we are not reducing from them. We are literally reducing from the liquid itself. If you start reducing the oil and the eggs and vanilla, you can really start changing the quality of your baked good. So I wouldn't touch those ingredients, but this can get a little bit tricky because some recipes don't call for liquid, like say, for example, cookies. Sourdough discard cookies are super popular and very delicious, but they don't call for liquid. So it is a little bit different to add sourdough discard to these types of recipes. So here is what I recommend doing if you want to toss a little discard into a cookie recipe. I would add less discard. So when I am converting a cookie recipe to a sourdough discard recipe, I add no more than 50 grams of starter, because any more than that, we're starting to add a lot of liquid into that recipe, which can really change the quality of the cookie. So I stick with 50 grams of discard. So then if I put 50 grams of starter discard into a cookie recipe, I slightly reduce the flour. I know earlier I said you should reduce the flour by half of the discard's weight, but it just doesn't work out the same way in recipes without liquid because there is no liquid to remove. So if I put 50 grams of starter in a cookie recipe, I usually just take out about a tablespoon or so of flour and it works out just fine. Now for the liquid portion, there's not a whole lot you can do because if you remember, I mentioned earlier in the video, you really don't want to change the oil. You don't want to take out any of the vanilla. You can't really control the size of the egg. So it's kind of hard to change those ingredients. If possible, I do reduce the liquid just a little bit by using a smaller egg if I have one. So just do the best you can. And really, this is just where experience comes into play and knowing how to adjust your recipes along the way. So again, if this feels confusing, if you're not sure what to do, just try it and see what happens. The more you do it, the easier it gets. But you might be asking, why do I even need to add sourdough discard to recipes? I see people ask this question all the time on Facebook groups, and it is a valid question. Look, chocolate chip cookies, they've been perfected. Brownies, they've been perfected. They don't necessarily need sourdough discard, but you can definitely add it in, and there are a few reasons why you might want to. First and foremost, it's fun. If you were into sourdough, and if you're a sourdough nerd like me, and you probably are, that's why you're watching this video, it's fun just to add sourdough discard into things, see how it changes the flavor, experiment with recipes, and that is 100% reason enough to put discard into your recipes. But also, putting discard into a recipe prevents food waste. If you are discarding every time you feed your sourdough starter, eventually you're going to have a lot of extra discard. And discard seems like this goopy stuff that's like kind of gross and just used for baking bread, but it's food. It's made with 50% flour. And like I mentioned earlier, you wouldn't take flour out of your pantry and just throw it away, so there's no sense in throwing away your discard either. Adding sourdough discard can also add a little bit of tanginess and complex flavor to your recipe. That may or may not be a good thing. I actually really love that about adding sourdough discard to recipes. I think they taste better with a little bit of discard, but it is one reason why some people add discard to recipes. Now, here's the thing though about adding discard to recipes for flavor. The older your discard, the more sour it will taste. So if you've had discard sitting in your fridge, say for like a month, when you put that into your recipe, it's going to have a lot more tanginess to it. That might be a good thing depending on your preferences. If you don't want that, you can always just feed that discard 1 or 2 times just to reduce that sourness and then start baking away. That might cause a little more accumulation of discard. I don't know if you want to do that, but the thing about sourdough, and I have a full YouTube video and a blog about this, I'll leave those in the description box, is that you can adjust the flavor of your bread and your discard recipes by the quality of your starter. So that's just something to think about. Now, some people like to add discard into recipes to long ferment them. I'm going to put out a longer video about this in the near future about how to long ferment your discard recipes. So I'm not going to get too much into it now, but essentially you can put discard into a recipe, pop it in the fridge for 3 to 5 days, let it do a cold proof and slow ferment in the fridge, and that helps the grains become more digestible. This is a great option for people who are gluten intolerant or gluten sensitive. If that's you, I would recommend talking to your healthcare provider to see if that's a good option for you, but I'll be talking more about that in a later video, so stay tuned for that. And another reason people might add discard to a recipe is because it adds moisture. Remember, that starter is made with 50% water, so you can create a lighter and fluffier and a softer baked good sometimes by putting sourdough discard in it. It really depends on the recipe, but it's definitely worth the experiment. Okay, so let's talk about a couple tips for success when it comes to adding discard into a recipe. Because now that we know actually how to do the calculation, there are a couple tricks that can make it more successful along the way. So one, I recommend pouring off the hooch if your starter has been sitting in the fridge for a while. So for example, here is my starter. I haven't fed it. Let me get a better look for you here. And you can see over here on this side, whoops, there we go. There is a little layer of gray liquid right here. This is hooch, and it's a little unappealing, but all it is a byproduct of the fermentation process. Essentially, it's just your starter telling you it's hungry, but that hooch creates a pretty acidic flavor. So I would recommend pouring off the hooch before using your discard because it will make your baked goods pretty sour if you keep it in there. That's a preference though. As always with anything in sourdough or anything you do, it's always up to you. Also, and I think I suggested this earlier, I wouldn't recommend using more than 200 grams of discard. Once you hit that 200 gram mark, we're really starting to take a lot of flour out of the recipe and a lot of liquid and adding in a lot of acidity, and it can really change the quality of your baked goods. So I would stick with 200 grams. I almost always use 50 to 100 grams because it's pretty forgiving that way. And even if the calculations don't work out right or something like that, it hardly matters. So anywhere between 50 and 100 I think is ideal, but no more than 200 grams. Also, I recommend adding the discard to the liquid part of your recipe. So I like to add it in with the eggs. Eggs are an emulsifier, and so when you stir the starter in with the eggs, it just mixes it right up. But whether or not your recipe calls for eggs, it is easiest for you to add that discard with the liquid ingredients so it can get mixed in. If you add it in with the dry ingredients, it can get clumpy and really hard to mix into the recipe. So put that discard in with the liquid ingredients or the eggs. I also recommend jotting down your conversions. Obviously, the math here is not that difficult, especially if you're using grams. But when you are doing this and keeping track of it in your head, it can be hard sometimes to remember, like, did I actually reduce that by 50 grams? Did I follow the recipe or did I do the conversion? It can just be hard to keep track of what you are doing. So I recommend jotting down the whole recipe with the conversions on a separate sheet of paper, following that, and then save that for next time so you don't have to worry about the conversions again. Okay, just a couple of frequently asked questions that I want to cover. So some of you might be wondering like, well, when I put sourdough starter into my bread recipes, it makes my bread rise. Is it going to make my cookies or my brownie rise? It is not. So the thing about starter recipes is we're not giving them time to bulk ferment like we do dough recipes. So it doesn't create bubbles and we're not building gluten strength to hold those bubbles. So your recipes aren't gonna rise like a loaf of bread in the oven. We still use the leavening agents in discard recipes. So if your recipe calls for baking soda and baking powder, don't forget to add them because your sourdough discard does not make your baked goods rise. We are still counting on those leavening agents. You might also be wondering if you can use active starter in discard recipes. Absolutely. So discard, it doesn't really matter if it's active or inactive. We just generally talk about inactive because that's the stuff that we've set aside. But you can definitely use active sourdough starter for your discard recipes. I just recommend, especially if you're measuring it in cups, to stir out the bubbles because those bubbles will take up space in your cup measurements. But otherwise, you can use active sourdough starter the same way you would inactive in any discard recipe. And you might also be wondering, can you freeze sourdough starter to use in discard recipes? Yes, you can. I have a full YouTube tutorial and blog post about that. I'll leave those in the description box. But freezing sourdough starter is really easy, and it's a great way to hold on to some starter if you can't bake right away. So if you have like a bunch of starter and you're like, man, I'm not gonna be able to bake cookies or a cake for like months. Don't worry about it. You can just freeze it in small portions, and when you're ready to bake, pull it out of the freezer, let it thaw, and use it as you would any other sourdough starter discard. And fun fact, you can freeze your sourdough starter, thaw it, and start feeding it, and have an active sourdough starter. That's kind of awesome. If you need more instructions, be sure to head over to my blog and check out my full blog tutorial about this. You can get that at moonandmagnolia.com, and I'll leave the link below in the description box. And if you're watching this and you're like, yes, I know exactly what I need to do, but I don't have a starter, don't sweat it. Head down to the description box and click the link for my guide to making and using sourdough starter. This is a 30-page ebook that will walk you through all the steps of making a sourdough starter, making your first loaf of bread, troubleshooting, frequently asked questions, discard recipes, and more. And last but not least, if you want to stay in the know with all the Moon and Magnolia happenings, be sure to sign up for the email list. When you sign up, I will send you links to all my recipes, videos, tutorials, and more. Thanks so much for stopping by today. I hope you are headed off to some amazing baking adventures, and I will see you again next time.